Have you ever wondered what's really in a traditional homemade drink? Well, today we're diving deep into the science behind Raksi, a potent and culturally vital spirit from the Himalayas. We're going to peel back the layers of tradition to find out what's really going on inside the bottle.
And that brings us to the big one, the question at the heart of all this. For literally centuries, communities have been making and drinking Raksi. But from a modern scientific standpoint, is it actually safe?
So, what even is Raksi? Well, it's a home-distilled spirit, usually made from grains like millet, rice, or barley. But here's the thing, it's so much more than just a drink. In Newari society, for instance, they call it Ela, and it's a non-negotiable part of religious ceremonies and cultural events. It's truly woven into the fabric of life there.
But with any unregulated homemade alcohol, there's always a little bit of fear, right? And the biggest fear, the real boogeyman, is methanol. It's a toxic alcohol that can pop up if the distillation isn't done just right. And get this, just 10 milliliters of it can cause permanent blindness. 30 can be lethal. So the stakes are incredibly high.
Okay, before we get to any lab results, it's absolutely crucial to understand the craft. This isn't some sterile factory process. We're talking about a centuries-old art form passed down through generations.
The process itself is just beautiful in its simplicity. First, they cook down the grains. Then, a starter culture called Marcha gets added to kickstart fermentation, creating this mash known as jand. That mash gets heated up in a traditional still. As the alcohol turns to vapor, it hits a cool vessel of water on top, which condenses it right back into a liquid. And that liquid is pure Raksi. It's just a fantastic example of old-school chemistry in action.
And not all Raksi is created equal. Its whole character can change depending on what you put in it. Millet, rice, barley. Some people even add rhododendron petals for a special aroma. The method matters too. There's a version called Tin Pani Raksi, where they change the condensing water 3 times, and it's famous for being way, way stronger than other versions.
All right, we've got a handle on the tradition. Now let's bring it into the 21st century. It's time to switch gears, head into the lab, and put Raksi under the microscope.
Now, the researchers here did not mess around. They gathered 10 different samples of what they called local alcohol Raksi, or LAR. 6 of these they actually brewed themselves for the study, following the traditional method to a T. The other 4, they just went out and collected them from local hotels. So they got a mix of a controlled brew and what people are actually drinking out there.
And the analysis they did was intense. They started with the simple stuff, color, odor, then they moved on to chemical tests for acidity and alcohol percentage. After that, they brought out the big guns, gas chromatography, to find every single compound inside. They even checked for bacteria, and to top it all off, put together a panel for a formal taste test. They really covered all the bases.
Okay, this is the moment we've been building up to. We've seen the tradition, we've seen the science. Now it's time for the verdict. What did they actually find in a glass of Raksi?
The first major finding was, wow, the alcohol content, the ABV, was all over the map. Completely. The researchers found some Raksi that was as low as 8.68% alcohol, and then other samples that clocked in at a whopping 45.32%. That's a massive, totally unpredictable range.
Let's just put that top number into perspective for a second. At over 45% alcohol, the strongest Raksi they tested is right up there with your standard whiskey or vodka. So this stuff can be a seriously potent spirit, which really shows you the power of that traditional method.
And then on the flip side, 8.68%. That's weaker than a lot of craft beers you'd find at the store. So the main point here is, when you're drinking homemade Raksi, you could be getting something pretty mild, or you could be getting something really, really strong. You just don't know.
Okay, so what about contamination? Did they find anything nasty? Well, the test did find some common bacteria in a few of the samples. But, and this is the important part, the study confirms the amounts were teeny tiny, well within a totally harmless range. So for these samples at least, bacteria wasn't a major worry. All right, we've talked strength, we've talked bacteria, but let's get back to the most critical question of all, the one that really started this whole investigation. What about that deadly methanol?
And here it is, the big reveal, straight from the research paper itself. There was no detection of methanol and propanol from the HSGC result. Only the ethanol was detected. That is a huge, huge finding. The high-tech gas chromatography test found 0, zilch, nada of those toxic alcohols.
And if you're a visual person, this chart from the study says it all. Look, the bars for ethanol, the good alcohol, they go up and down across the samples. But the bars for methanol and propanol, they're completely flat, a big fat 0, for every single one of the 10 samples. The data could not be clearer.
So the Raksi they tested was safe from toxic alcohols. Awesome. But is it any good? The final piece of the puzzle was the sensory test, because after all the science, it still comes down to the human experience. How does it actually taste?
Well, the results were pretty impressive. On a 5-point scale, a panel of 10 different people gave 3 of the samples near-perfect, excellent ratings. Almost all the others were rated good to very good. So even with that crazy inconsistency in strength, the overall quality and taste were consistently high. People liked it.
So what does this all mean when we put it together? The lab coats have met the traditional stills, and we've got our answers. Let's distill this all down to the final takeaway.
This gives us a really balanced look at Raksi. On the one hand, you've got its immense cultural value, a really positive taste profile, and it's even used in traditional remedies. But on the other hand, the process is unregulated, the strength is a total wild card, and there's always a risk of contamination if it's not made with care.
So, let's just nail down the key points. First and foremost, the Raksi tested in this study was safe from methanol. That's the big headline. Second, the strength can be all over the place. Third, people generally think it's a high-quality, enjoyable drink. And finally, and this is so important, all of this depends on careful preparation. Hygiene is everything.
You know, what this whole investigation really shows is that science and tradition don't have to be enemies. In fact, modern science can be this incredibly powerful tool to validate and understand ancient practices, helping make sure that a tradition as important as Raksi can be preserved and enjoyed safely for generations to come.
And that leaves us with a final thought to chew on. Raksi passed this test, which is fantastic, but the question is much bigger than just one spirit. As our world keeps changing, how do we find that perfect balance between protecting these incredible ancient traditions and holding them to the standards of modern safety? What's the best path forward?